Hello there, ladies and gentlemen. This is Orphanlast, aka Skylar Madison, and today I'm going to show you how I animated these books, gradually moving this brick off the bookshelf. Now, this mat that you're looking at on the screen is the exact same mat that I created in the previous tutorial on the brickfall animation. It's just been slightly modified. And if you look at my timeline, you can see that just as the brick begins to fall, the mat is no longer exposed for the rest of the animation on the X sheet. This is because we don't want the mat to mat out the brick as the brick falls. But what I need to do is create another mat that extends across the entire length of the bookshelf. So I go to the timeline and create a new vector level and call it book mat. I then copy the shape of the original mat and then paste it into the new book mat level. I then expose this mat for the full extent of the animation by extending that frame from the first frame to the last frame of the animation. I then go to the animation tab and we see our books level, and we can also see our mat books level as well. I then right click, go add effects, mat out, and it creates a mat effects node. I then add the books column node to the source of this effects node, and then the mat column gets plugged into the mat portion of the mat effects node. I then plug the mat effects node into the X sheet. Make sure yours looks pretty much just like mine. I then demonstrate that the mat is indeed working by using the edit tool to move the books right where the mat is. And when I press on the preview mode, we can see that we can't see the books through the mat. This is exactly what we want. So I delete the software keyframe from the timeline because working with the edit tool was just for demonstration purposes. In the preview mode, I can see that the mat needs some small adjustments, so I pull out my control point editor and make some minor adjustments. I then select my books level and expose the first frame all the way to the point to where the brick is just about to fall. I do this so that I can create a manual keyframe right where I want it on the timeline without creating a whole new level strip file. While drawing this manual keyframe, I turn off the brick column so that I can see what I'm drawing. Notice how I'm using the faint red and blue arcs as a reference. The blue arc represents the spine of the book, and the red line represents the opening of the book. Ever since I started to introduce the time-lapse feature in my Opentoonz tutorials, I've noticed that I've gotten a few thumbs downs for my videos. I'm not really quite sure why. I have a few ideas, but I'm not quite sure why. I spend tons of time editing these videos so that my narrative matches up with what I'm doing on the screen. I even make sure that the important stuff happens in slow motion. If you're having difficulty understanding what I'm doing at this point, it's because you're at a beginner's level. I've already gone over the basics. You can watch the basics in a playlist on my channel, which includes the most helpful Opentoonz tutorials that I've found littered around YouTube, but a good portion of that playlist does include my videos as well. So now I have my first manual keyframe with the book standing up, and I have another manual keyframe of the book laying down on the shelf. Now, in my first video of the brickfall animation, I said I might animate the book falling with the brick. That was a guess, not a promise. I found that working with just the spine of the book was extremely useful in determining the entire book's animation. So rather than animating the entire book all the way through, in perspective and everything, which is very difficult, I decided to just draw and animate the spine first, and then draw and animate the rest of the book from there. I copied my first book spine drawing onto another frame and dragged it right next to the second manual keyframe I drew of the book laying down on the bookshelf on the timeline. I then rotated it and moved it into position so that this can help me in the in-betweening phases. I found that my second manual keyframe had the book being way too thick, so I selected the level and shrunk it down a bit and made sure that my book spine drawing matched up with my manual keyframe drawing rather well. I then right-click on the level strip and a drop-down menu appears. I then click on Add Frames. I set the From Frame to 3, 2, 25. So the level strip added the levels that I wanted, but it did it out of order. It didn't really do it the way I wanted, but I worked with it anyways. The way that I did this was rather confusing. Again, the level strip's controls are rather weird. So I noticed that now that I added those levels in the level strip, neither of the book spine drawings I made are displaying anything on the timeline. So it basically just renumbered the levels that I initially drew there. They're not showing up because the levels are a completely different number than what they originally were, if that makes sense. So I went to my upright book spine drawing and copied and pasted it into level 3 on the level strip. On the X sheet, I deleted the frame next to the second manual keyframe of the book laying down. Then I clicked and dragged my second book spine drawing from the level strip and placed it next to the second manual keyframe. I did the same thing with the upright book spine, only at the beginning of the animation. On the level strip, I selected the first book spine level, scrolled down, holding Shift, and then clicked on the second book spine image. If you notice, a gray button appears that says In Between on all the blank levels on the level strip. I clicked that, and I kept the timing on linear and then clicked the button that said In Between. Now, notice how it auto-in-betweened the book's gradual fall on all those levels that used to be empty. I then selected all the book spine level drawings except for the first and last one because they're already on the timeline by pressing on the first and last one, holding Shift, and then clicked and dragged them onto the timeline. Again, like I said, I did this rather convoluted. To better understand what I did, only in a more organized sort of way, I have a link to a video made by Opentoonz Training, which demonstrates a more effective way of doing what I just did. This 51 animation challenges is primarily an educational process for me, but along the way, if I'm able to teach you guys what I'm learning, I'm going to do so with these videos, with the 51 animation challenges series. I then review the animation, and by and large, I liked it. I did notice, however, that some of the levels weren't filled in with a color, but that's fine. I'm not really quite sure why I decided to color this animation as I was going along. Ultimately, if you color your animation as you're going, you can run into some problems, and in fact, I did run into some problems because of it. These problems are basically like if you want to merge levels. I then activated the brick column so that I could see how everything worked together, then turned off the brick column again, and started drawing the rest of the book on the first and last level of the book spine drawings by first drawing a line for the opening of the book on the first and last level on the book spine drawings. Then, I selected the first and last level of the book spine drawings, holding Shift, and clicked in between, and kept the timing on linear. I then reviewed the animation and was happy with the result. I then drew the top of the book on each and every one of the book spine drawings. I found that my second manual keyframe didn't really fit in with the rest of the animation that I had already worked out at this point, but it served its purpose as a nice reference for me, so I deleted it off the timeline. I then tested the animation with the brick column turned back on, and it worked out well. But it made me feel like the book's fall should probably be animated on twos, just like the brick. But I decided to do that a little bit later for some reason. I tried to auto in between the thickness of the book using the level strip again, but this really didn't work out for me very well. I tried multiple techniques, but it just didn't work out. So I just manually drew the thickness of the book on each and every single drawing on the book spine drawings, refining each and every frame and colored each frame as well. I then tested the animation a few times, and I thought it looked rather good. I really thought that I'd be able to use this same workflow for the rest of the books on this bookshelf, but that just didn't seem to work out very well for me at all. And actually, I actually edited that content out, because it's a long, drawn-out process of me failing at making a successful animation. So, rather than waste your time, I'm moving on. I wound up deleting every other frame for some of this animation, and animated them on twos because I thought that this felt like the book was moving in unison with the brick's movement. I also messed with the timing until I felt like it felt like a nice movement. You just need to use your own judgment. I then created another vector level and called it secondary book. I copied all the books from the other column and pasted it into the first frame and got to work. Most of my work with the books was just drawing out the spine of the book and then copying and pasting it into each frame, selecting the spine, moving the anchor, and then rotating the book ever so slightly in order to create the animation. And all the while I was thinking about the physics that I've noticed books have when they are stacked on a shelf and then gradually tilt over. For some odd reason, this is something that I have actually personally spent time observing in the past. And as I was animating each book, I was making sure to mimic the timing that the first book had. When was it animated in 2s? When was it animated in 1s? And I basically just mimicked that accordingly. I put the first and second book into their own sub-X sheet, and outside of the sub-X sheet, I animated the spine of the third book on its own level, and if you've been following along with this video, you should know exactly how to do it. With the third book, I didn't see any reason to get it to rest on top of the first and second book, like how the second book rested on the first. I felt like this reflects the real-world physics quite a bit. I then merged the third book into the sub-X sheet where the first and second book were contained. One of the hassles I found was that every time that I messed around with putting my books into the sub-X sheet, the book matte effects work that I did at the beginning of the video kept getting undone. So I decided to throw the matte into the sub-X sheet as well. This way, I wouldn't have to mess around with the effects schematic every time I'd place a book into the sub-X sheet. Because I kept putting objects into the sub-X sheet incrementally, I realized at this point that I kept on making sub-X sheets in sub-X sheets. Basically, I'd make a sub-X sheet, and then there'd be a sub-sub-X sheet, and then a sub-sub-sub-X sheet, and all that. It's not very orderly. So I decided to explode these sub-sub-X sheets until everything was nice, neat, and orderly in just one sub-X sheet. Once I did that, I went back into the animation tab and played the animation once again in the preview mode. Everything looked pretty good, so I selected all the books from the first frame inside the sub-X sheet, copied them, and deleted them from the columns inside of the sub-X sheet. I then exited the sub-X sheet and pasted them into a new column called Book 4. With the new Book 4 column, I exposed this frame for the full extent of the animation. Pulled out my edit tool and created a keyframe by pressing the key on the viewer. Now, if there's anything that you see me doing that I don't explain, it's either me problem solving things or something that you need to figure out pretty much for yourself. Each person's workflow will be slightly different, and basically your animation will pose different sorts of problems than mine will, and you just kind of need to just figure it out a little bit. But I'll kind of describe what I'm doing here. I'm inside the sub-X sheet, organizing things, noticing coloring glitches. I found the position where Book 3 stopped moving. And with the Book 4 column selected, I went ahead and selected the Edit tool, moved the center to a good location for shearing, and then I just went ahead and sheared it. I went into the animation tab, messed around with the curves a bit to make sure that the speed in, speed out of all the animation worked out well for this specific column. I kept scrubbing through the animation with each alteration with the curves. Now, not all of the books need to be shifting, so I selected most of them, copied them, then deleted them off of the Books 4 column, and then pasted them into a new vector level called B Group. I then exposed this frame for the full extent of the entire animation on the timeline. But on the Books 4 column, I still needed to animate the 3D effect of the book, so I made sure to use the level strip in order to draw it out without any visual disturbance. Then I needed to do the same with my B Group column. for some reason, things just weren't looking very good inside of the preview mode, so I put all of the books into the same sub-X sheet, and while inside of it, I selected all the book columns and put them into their own sub-X sheet, basically a sub-X sheet, if you will, and played around with the animation tab to make sure that the effect schematic would work well with everything. If you find things have been auto-grouped, you can right-click on a group node, and then a drop-down menu appears, and you can select Ungroup in order to make sense of what's going on in the effects schematic. Somehow, in the middle of animating everything, the other brick on the other side of the bookshelf got deleted, so I copied some of the brick that is already existing, and then pasted it onto its own column in the sub-X sheet. It didn't really deserve its own column, but I got lazy at this point. So then I turned on the preview mode and decided to take a good look at the animation. And that's it, ladies and gentlemen. That's the brickfall animation. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. If you didn't like it, please like, share, and subscribe anyways.